Hello and welcome to Lecture 1 for Art History, Delaware County Community College from the Renaissance to the present. So I'm going to be making a series of lecture videos that you will be able to view on Canvas. I'm going to cover the Italian section of Chapter 18 today. We will not be covering the other portions of Chapter 18. I will make a separate video to go over Canvas and introduce the course in general. So again, this is Lecture 1, and we are going to start by looking at, again, Italian art. So let's share my screen here. Okay, so again, we are talking about Chapter 18. This is 14th century art in Europe, and we are going to again be covering Italy. So the first image in the text, and this is typical of the textbook, will cover something that they consider to be of importance to the general overall for the chapter. And this is Ambrogio Lorenzetti's fresco from the Palazzo di Pubblico in Siena. It was painted between 1338 and 1339. Again, it is a fresco. Fresco is a type of mural painting that was prominent during the Roman Empire and is also used throughout the Renaissance. It's a method in which the use of plastered wall is combined together with the combination of pigments, and it hardens directly into the wall. So it's a long-lasting mural painting method. So this shows us a full view into the room. The painting is covered in greater detail later in the chapter. You can see a couple different sections of the mural and the large scale of it. By Palazzo di Pubblico, what that means is it's a public palazzo, a public palace. So this was painted in a room that was used for the local government. In Siena, they had a republic. So it was the Republic of Siena, and the style of painting murals here, as well as the use of perspective and space, is very reminiscent of Roman mural painting from the Roman times. And it highlights the Sienese government, and it shows both country life as well as city life in an idealistic manner. There are additional frescoes that cover additional sections of the wall as you move into other directions here that also will deal with the opposite, the negative effects of government. It is in essence a piece of propaganda, something that was designed and presented with the idea of presenting the quality and importance of the republic that the Sienese people had. So again, we'll talk about it a bit more as we move through the chapter. So Florence is where the, so we should probably take a look at the map here. So some of the major issues that were happening as we enter the 14th century. So this is a transition period. This is where Europe begins to emerge from the Middle Ages. If you took the class that covers from the ancient times all the way up until the late medieval period, we are essentially picking up with where that class concluded, although some of this information is also included within that class. What this map shows us here is Europe and the spread of the Black Death. So the Black Death had a huge toll on Europe. Many sections of Italy in particular, and cities, saw population death of much as 40 to 50%. So literally half of the people in many of these cities died during this period. And this shows the years and the spread as it came from China throughout Europe and the horrible effects that it had. Our primary focus again here is just going to be on Italy for this chapter. We will be looking at the rest of Europe as we progress forward. This shows a more generalized map, which some of the different kingdoms that existed at the time period. Europe was not unified yet into the countries as we know them. Italy was a series of city-states, Florence and Siena being city-states of their own. The papal states, meaning the Pope, controlled those. So we begin by looking at Florence and some of the important tidbits in history in regard to this time period are the developments toward the Renaissance. So some historians refer to this period as proto-Renaissance, meaning pre-Renaissance. It is also referred to as late medieval. The Gothic style dominated Northern Europe and France during this time period still. But in Italy, which was closer to the styles of the Roman Empire, they maintained a greater level of classicism than was seen in other parts of Europe. Another important development here is a movement towards secularization, meaning that we are moving away from the idea of the church dominating everyone's lives and more towards civics and government centered around human-centered ideas. What we see with this particular image here is Florence, and this is the Palazzo della Signoria, and it shows us, which is their town hall. It has a large bell tower that projects up from it. You can see that the upper section of it has what's called crenulations. This is a defensive technique. There are elements to this that are Gothic in style, although a bit more simplified. The significance of this being the town hall is similar to, again, what we looked at a moment ago in Siena. The idea that the city hall, the town hall, the center of the republic, the government, is the center of life in Florence as it was in Siena. If you again took the previous course or just have interest in what was happening in other parts of Europe, you'll see that in France in particular, that Gothic cathedrals dominated town centers. So there was the significance there is the church and its power, whereas here we see the republic taking its significant position. To the right, you can see the three large arches here and an open porch-like space where you can see that sculptures are on display, as well as sculptures on display throughout the palazzo here, the open space in front of the palazzo, excuse me, the piazza. And this large archways is referred to as a loggia. So it's three large arches that create a covered space for people to gather outdoors if it were to rain or things of that nature. Another important element in Florence was, again, still religion. It's not just the development of buildings of that type don't necessarily mean that religion was insignificant. It merely shows that there is a movement toward centralized governments that are not purely about the religious faith. This is from the baptistry of San Giovanni, St. John, and I do not have a picture of the baptistry in here. In Italy, baptistries were typically separate from the cathedrals themselves, and smaller domed buildings was fairly typical. This is a small domed building that had three entrances. Three entrances is fairly typical as well, in reference to the Trinity, the Holy Trinity. So San Giovanni in this case is St. John the Baptist. And the 20 scenes on the door all are in honor of John the Baptist in different states. The presentation here is within a quatrefoil, four-lobed shape that is very typical of Gothic architecture and Gothic styles. These are large-scale bronze doors that would have been opened to allow people in with additional decoration. We will look more at this baptistry into the Renaissance as the two additional sets of doors that we'll look at in the future of this class are also of great significance. We have one detail, and the detail here is the baptism of the multitude. So we have John the Baptist himself right here performing a baptism. You can see that they have utilized a landscape type setting. There's not a great sense of depth. The figures do have some three-dimensional modeling as well as overlapping. Notice the drapery around St. John himself and the way he holds it suggests some three-dimensional volume for the figure, but there is a bit of a sense of floating space. So this is, styles are beginning to change here, and they're particularly distinctive from styles in Northern Europe at this time. This is a painting by the artist Cimabue, whose real name was Siene de Pepe, and Cimabue was his nickname. And this is Virgin and Child Enthroned. This is a very popular and common image from this time period. The Virgin Mary was of great significance in France as well as in Italy. And she held, as the mother of God and as queen of heaven, she held an important and prominent place. The position of Italy and its location gave it a trade status with the Byzantine Empire, which was located in Constantinople in what is Turkey today. Again, referencing back to the previous course, if you took that course, you would have done a chapter on it. The Byzantine Empire was an extension of the Roman Empire, again, based in Constantinople. The Byzantine style of painting spread back into Italy, and this work by Cimabue has very Byzantine-like quality, particularly in the use of gold, which is prominent in the background as well as highlighting on the figures. There is a sense of space with the throne that the Virgin sits on. She is highlighting the fact that Christ is on her lap. Notice the halos. When you look closely at it, notice that the faces of the angels that surround her there's little distinction from one to the other, or even when you look closely at the angels' faces and the Virgin's face itself, there's little individualization. So there's still a great sense of generalization here that is typical of medieval art. There is, again, some use of three-dimensional space in the throne, and then we have additional prophet figures in the lower section that have some greater sense of individualization. So it's has subtle sense of asymmetry, and there is some elements of lifelike qualities to the painting, but in essence, it is the very Byzantine in style, very medieval in style. This next one, you should note a change, and that is one of the significant things that we're looking at, particularly in this chapter, is the developments of characteristics of the Renaissance. This is by perhaps one of the most important painters, not only of his era, but of the Italian Renaissance in general, and that is Giotto di Bondone. Giotto was a student of Cimabue. So this is the teacher's painting, and this is the student's painting. Notice that they are, in essence, almost the same thing in the general idea of it as Virgin and Child Enthroned. So it reflects that influence, it reflects the importance of the Virgin, again, in Italy at this time. It has, the symmetrical organization is relatively similar. Again, Mary sits with Jesus on her lap in a similar manner. Gold background is relatively similar. But the differences are particularly important. There's a far greater sense of three-dimensionality and space. And when you look at the two paintings side by side, that should become more apparent. Notice the angels in the Cimabue painting as they feel sort of stacked, each one just rising up, and none of their faces block one another. It doesn't give any sense of a crowd around a throne. And the Virgin Mary herself, look at the way that the drapery folds come around her, seems more schematic. It's almost like little dolls that have little dresses that you can just stick onto them, as if we could pull this off and put something else on her clothing-wise. But in Giotto's painting, look at the space between her legs and the way the drapery folds in between it. and the way we see shadows there, and a strong suggestion of a physical presence of her body. Look at the way the arm emerges out from under her robe and the space that wraps around her. Again, to compare the other figures, he's using observational detail. So he is observing the way things actually appear in real life, and he is utilizing those elements. Notice this figure right here in particular, and this one here, that their faces are partially blocked by the frame of the architecture itself. Again, the figures of the angels overlap one another in a more realistic and natural way. Again, look at the way the drapery folds fall around the angel's arms here. There is a greater sense of credibility of three-dimensionality. So he's utilizing the same traditional approach, the gold background, the centralized figure of the Virgin, but at the same time, his observation of nature is the primary thing here that distinguishes Giotto's work. His most famous work, and perhaps therefore his most important work, is a fresco. Again, I mentioned fresco with the very first image we saw, and the fresco technique, again, does date back to the ancient Romans. It is called buon fresco in Italian. It is a technique that uses a water-based paint that is applied to wet plaster, and it bonds with it so that it creates a very permanent effect in the wall, and therefore the paint doesn't chip off easily. And fresco paintings therefore can last hundreds, if not thousands of years, by comparison to a standard mural where we apply paint directly onto a dried wall. So there is a little details about that as you look at the textbook. This is called the Scoravini Chapel. And again, these are frescoes. It is called the Scoravini Chapel. Its other name that it typically is referred to is as the Arena Chapel. And that name comes from an ancient Roman arena that is very close to where this was built. The exterior is rather unassuming. So here we see the entryway from the back, and here we see the view from the entryway moving to a small altar in the front. So again, it's a chapel, it's a small little church. Notice that there is blue decoration across the top and how that unifies throughout the individual panels. You can see as you look to the left and right that there are individual framed panels that have marble decoration around them as if there were stone marble decoration all around it. And this is very typical of Roman mural painting. So Giotto is drawing on the traditions of ancient Rome, and this is one of the major things about the Renaissance and why we call it the Renaissance. It means rebirth. And by rebirth, it is the Roman Empire in styles, in law, in the human-centered concepts that are re-emerging, and why we call it the Renaissance. So as we look into the altar space here, there are some small details along the sides here that play off of different biblical stories. Some of these are making specific reference to the Scoravini family. They made their money as bankers. They lent people money and charged them interest. This was illegal at the time. It's referred to as usury. So they were going to be damned to hell as a result of this. So the chapel itself is in a way to redeem themselves for the sins that they've committed. It's also a prominent display of wealth because they've hired who was a fairly renowned painter at the time to make the chapel and to make the paintings in the chapel. So it displays their wealth, it shows, but it also shows their piety and their attempt to make up for that. And there's two small scenes. One here shows where Judas gets the money to betray Christ, which could be a reference to the family itself, and the other is the visitation, which is when Mary visits her cousin Elizabeth. So we see a series of additional images along the sides. If you turn and look the other direction, if you're in it, there is a Last Judgment scene on the far back wall. That would be where you enter / exit. So there are some more important panels, you might say, that are highlighted here. These 4 panels is one particular section. Again, notice the decoration in between it is painted in a way to suggest that there's marbling there. The lower sections of the chapel itself are also painted in a way that makes it look like there's marbling in there, as well as sculptures within it. This is a technique that the ancient Romans also used. So this is something else that Giotto is directly looking at the ancient Romans approach. So these 4 scenes here that are highlighted, note the way they function in relationship to one another. It is telling the life of Christ. At the top, we see the miracle of the wine, when they ran out of wine and Jesus comes along and says, yeah, you know, let's make the water into wine so the party can go on. And that's what we're seeing here. Over here, we are seeing the raising of Lazarus. So notice Jesus's hand gesture here. There is a dead body or dead person right here, and that is Lazarus himself. And we have noticed the way that people's faces are covered, covering their face to, you know, cover the smell from how horrible the dead guy smells. And here they are praying to Jesus, asking for his help. As we go to the lower section, we have now reached the point where Jesus has died. So this is called the Lamentation, and this is when Jesus has been taken down from the cross. And the next one is where they will entomb him, and he will then rise from the dead. There are compositional elements that Giotto is using here as well that helps us to direct our eye and move away from this more traditional, symmetrical, everything in the dead center approach. Notice the sloping of the ground here. The primary aspect of this painting, here's the one with the dead, with Jesus dying. The focal point is here. It's the dead Christ being embraced, I believe, by his mother or Mary Magdalene. I'm not sure which. This is St. John the Evangelist. But look at the way it's dramatically off center in the lower left corner instead of putting it right here in the middle. Look at the way the sloping rock leads our eye directly to it, as well as the direction and gaze of all the people in addition to it are the angels, all things drawing our attention to it. When we take it in view back further, you can also see that the rocks in the raising of Lazarus also lead our attention down to it and draw us right to Christ. And then we have a similar diagonal approach here. The other image that is highlighted, and an important one also from the chapel, is the kiss of Judas. So here we see the moment in which Judas, the betrayer of Christ, identifies him to the Roman soldiers so that he can be arrested. When he was paid to turn Jesus in, he said that he would kiss him, and that's how they would know which one was Jesus. So the other thing that's really a breakthrough and change here is the crowd and the overlap. Again, thinking back to the beginning of this particular lecture and the bronze doors, there's very little overlap of figures and 3-dimensionality. He has placed a group in the back here, a crowd where we can barely see the figures. There's a tight compression of space, and then we have this psychological interaction between Jesus and Judas. So the way that he looks directly at him and the way his body is enveloped inside of Judas's cloak. We also have on the far right another portion of the story is Peter was the one person that defended Jesus in this situation, and he cuts a man's ear off right here. But figures have their backs to us entirely. Figures are cut off in ways that are, again, this is based on observation and creates a stage-like feeling. That's true of these images as well. It's as if we're watching a play, which again was an important part of people's lives in this time. So the figures are like actors on a stage that move through what appears to be real space. They're grounded on real ground. Look at the way the foot seems to suggest a sense of space. This guy's stepping on this other guy's foot. All of these things are him looking back at the Roman Empire and the way the Romans painted, but it's also Giotto's approach to observing realistic details. The use of the blue throughout also unifies the whole scene and also creates a sense of reality as well, because again, that gold background in no way makes you think of a real place. It's supposed to evoke heaven, is the idea of the gold background. So again, Giotto is a particularly important painter. His work is considered as groundbreaking. Giorgio Vasari, who was a Renaissance biographer and considered to be, in essence, the father of art history. He wrote about, he knew many, Michelangelo, Leonardo, and he wrote about them. And he specifically said that Giotto had eradicated the Greek, that old Greek manner or the Byzantine style that is apparent here in Cimabue's work, and that he based his work again on observation. Artists that we'll look at into the more fully blown Renaissance period in the next century went to the Arena Chapel, spent time studying in it. Michelangelo did. Many other important artists that we will discuss were heavily influenced by Giotto's work. So the counterpart to Florence is Siena. So these two cities are both city-states, and I showed on the map that they're both in the area that is called Tuscany today. They were independent, and again, they were referred to as city-states. City-states go back to the very earliest phases of human development in the Sumerian people. And a city-state is a city that is its own government and controls the territory around it. So if you're a Delaware County Community College and you live somewhere in that area, it would be as if Philadelphia were its own city, which it is, and then it controlled everything within a certain territory around it, which would be called its city-state. These cities sometimes, they certainly traded and communicated with one another, but they often warred with one another as well. So Siena and Florence were rivals. There is a distinctive difference to the art from Siena in comparison to that of the art of Florence at this particular time in the mid 1300s. Again, Giotto is breaking ground in a new approach that again is moving us in the direction of the Renaissance. But he was an innovator, and he was, again, really kind of cutting edge, you might say, for his time. Whereas other artists continued to work with more typical traditional approaches. One of the most important painters from Siena is Duccio di Buonasegna. So most of these artists' names, if you note, they are, again, di Buonasegna means where he's from. Giotto's name is di Bondone. Leonardo da Vinci, it means where they have come from. So it's fairly common, therefore, that many of these people were not from wealth and didn't have family last names. So many of these last names, therefore, merely reference where they came from. So they are correctly identified by their first name: Giotto, Duccio, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, as opposed to being called by their last names, which is something we typically do in more modern times. Say like 20th century artists like Jackson Pollock is typically referred to just as Pollock by many people. So there is a distinction there. So Duccio's work, note again, a strong similarity to what we saw with the Cimabue painting as well as the Giotto painting of the Madonna enthroned. What we're looking at here is a reconstruction of the front and back of the Mastia altarpiece from the Sienese cathedral. So the left portion is the front, and on the right, this is the back. So this is a giant altarpiece. In its original size, it would have been 13 feet wide. And these are all individual panels. So there's one giant panel in the center, as well as small panels along the bottom, smaller panels on the back, and then the upper sections. It has a Gothic quality to the frame that almost makes it look like a building. So here's a detail of just the front, and here's a detail of just the main panel. So when you look at the two together, again, there's a tremendously large number of images here. You can see there is an empty space here, empty space here. These are ones that they either don't know what was there, or they're simply now lost. For reasons that I don't actually know, this altarpiece was broken up into individual pieces and is no longer in its original full state. So this is, again, a reconstruction to show us what it would have looked like. It was a very major and important piece in its own time period. Duccio, when it was completed in Siena, they took a holiday and they held a parade through the city to the cathedral carrying the central panel. And then it was installed with dedications and the priests and so forth. So it was a great importance to the community at the time. And again, it has the central panel of it has strong similarities to the first two Madonnas enthroned that we saw. He is utilizing more of Giotto's approaches than was Cimabue. And you can note, again, some similar qualities to the projection of her knee, the curvature of the fabric around her. Her throne seems a bit more three-dimensional. There is a more natural sense of overlap to the figures, but they still seem to float in space somewhat in comparison. And he is very careful, you can note, to not cover anyone's individual faces. So that still seems like, why are these guys this height and then these ones rise above him? You can see that there are some kneeling figures. We have different saints here. I believe that's John the Baptist right there. And they've all gathered around Mary in this glorious altarpiece that would again been the center of the cathedral itself. So that's the major centerpiece there. Then we have a number of smaller paintings that also include some of the progression and some of the same ideas in Giotto's work. In this one, again, we see one that Giotto himself also painted. So this is the Raising of Lazarus. So again, here we have similar qualities to some degree. Notice he maintains the gold background throughout. He does not use that unifying blue that Giotto used. Again, body's still wrapped, has a greenish color to him. We do still have some people covering their face in disgust. We have a kneeling figure, in essence, begging Jesus for help. We see an overlapping of heads and figures in a much more natural sense, again, similar to that of the approach of Giotto. Doesn't quite have the same physical credibility. There's a more surface, detailed, decorative approach to Duccio's work that also is reminiscent of fabrics that come from Siena. It was an important center of textile development. So here we have the betrayal of Jesus, another scene, again, that we just looked at by Giotto. So again, we have similar, the same stories are being told. The big noticeable difference, again, is there's a greater sense of action here, but the biggest noticeable difference should be the blue sky is not there. The figures, again, as I said just a moment ago, don't have quite the same credibility of three-dimensional space. There's almost a floating sense to this group here. Jesus kind of looks like he's standing there, but some of these figures, they just kind of seem like they're floating around. There's a decorative quality to the way that he paints the robes with the golden outlines around it that don't have the same three-dimensional feeling as Giotto. It is the same exact story, but there's less of that psychological connection between Jesus and Judas here, and there's a greater emphasis on the action, the way the figures reach in to grab Jesus. We still see Peter cutting off the ear, and we clearly see a group coming around that is similar. When we look at them side by side, again, you can see some of the differences. There's a the three-dimensionality. Look at the ground line space. Look at the way the figure's feet seem on the ground. Look at the way the drapery falls onto the ground. And then the pulling back of space and the way that this so highlights this connection between their, from a psychological sense. But here with all the shimmering gold and the floating sense of some of the figures, you don't have the quite same level of three-dimensional approach. Again, it has much more of a feeling to it of action that is being driven by the central action here, as opposed to the psychological unity of the figures in Giotto's approach. So this again is the contrast between the Sienese painters and the painters from Florence. And to some degree, these things will carry on as we continue forward. The Sienese painting style had other followers that came, excuse me, after Duccio. And this particular image is by the painter Simone Martini. So here, again, we have a famous scene that we will see repeatedly throughout the course, particularly the beginning of this course, where we're talking a lot in regard to religion. And this is called the Annunciation. And it is the moment when the angel Gabriel comes and tells Mary that she is to be the mother of God and a mother of Jesus, that, you know, she's going to have God's son. And this is a moment that she recoils from, and she's typically reading. Mary typically wears a blue gown with red underneath it. It's fairly typical, which you can see here again. And you can see the red and the blue here, the blue with a little bit of red right there. So these are typical identifiers that let us know it's Mary. Notice again that the gold background is predominant here. The angel's wings were flapping. There's words actually coming out of his mouth as they go toward Mary. She recoils as if she's a little afraid. And then we have these figures on the side here that are additional saint figures, as well as figures in the medallions up above. And again, the strongly Gothic style to the throne, excuse me, to the frame. This is also from this time period was the, it was referred to as, I'm blanking the name, sorry, the Great Schism. So up until this point in the middle part of the 1300s in the 14th century, all the popes that had been elected had been from Italy. The French felt that there should be a French pope. So the French cardinals, that's the highest position you can achieve in the Catholic Church. And then the Pope comes from the group of cardinals called the College of Cardinals. And they vote on who is to be the next Pope. So all the French cardinals got together and voted on a French cardinal to be the next Pope. The Italians still voted for an Italian, and they split, and they called it the Great Schism. So a papal court developed in France at Avignon. And Simone Martini was a painter that actually went and worked for that particular papal court. That that created influence and spread the Sienese style into France. And this style is therefore also known as the International Gothic style. So because of the influence from Italy, because of the combination of ideas that come from the French Gothic style, it's therefore called international in the way the things came together. So back to where we started from, which is with Lorenzetti's, Ambrogio Lorenzetti's paintings for the Palazzo Pubblico. So this also builds on Giotto's concepts, and it does stand out distinctively from the work of Martini as well as Duccio, and fits more in with the Roman style of mural painting that this typically reflects. And again, it is a large mural space. This shows the full view here of both city and country life combined. So here's a detail of the city section and a detail of the country section. So in the city section, you can see the use of perspective. So perspective is when two-dimensional space is on a flat surface. You use diagonal lines referred to as orthogonal lines that create this three-dimensional sense of actual architectural space. The perspective isn't entirely accurate, but it does give us a sense of three-dimensionality of the buildings. And again, it is very reflective of the way the Romans painted. This one seems to be a bit better detail-wise. So notice again here we can see groups of different figures. The scale of this is not accurate. Foreground figures would appear larger, but as we go further back, you can see workers up here on the roof. So he spared no little detail as far as really giving us a sense of city life. These are dancers performing some sort of dance here. These may have been men dressed as women, which was typical of the time. We have shopkeepers here selling their wares. Again, we can see people working on roofs in the far background. We see the city wall that would have protected people. We have an allegorical figure with a banner, you know, saying that people are protected under the good government, because this again is the good government theme. As we pan off back, and this is based on the actual hillsides of Tuscany around Siena. The building itself is also not the building. Some of these buildings do highlight the fact that this is really Siena, as we can see the campanile and dome of the cathedral, of Siena's cathedral up in the upper section of the hill. As we go out into the country, we see different aspects of life from the typical of the time period. We have wealthy people that are going to go out hunting. We have farm people working the land, and it shows all seasons combined as one. So there are activities that are occurring here that would occur in spring, summer, and fall, as opposed to this being, you know, one particular season. So the idea of it again is this idyllic vision of the way that Siena would have, you know, the rule of it, they refer to it as the Nine. It was a council of 9 elected officials. Yes, it was a republic and people did vote, but it was a very small section of people in the city, men only, and only wealthy men that were able to vote. But it still was not a singular king that was born to rule. So the idea behind the mural is again to show how idyllic life would be living in Siena under the Nine. Oh, I seem to not have. So that the book has an image of the Sienese cathedral is, excuse me, cathedral, not the cathedral, the Campano and the Palazzo Pubblico, where the building, where this painting is housed. So again, the Black Death is the other major issue of this time period. And, you know, considering that the reason we're not in a classroom right now is because we are experiencing a pandemic ourselves. Again, this was a class that would have been scheduled 3 days a week on campus, but instead we're doing it online. The Black Death certainly is something that, you know, ties into our own existence in that way. This particular image here, it comes from what they call an art in its context. It is Andrea del Ciccone, and is enthroned Christ with saints from the Strozzi altarpiece. So again, another altarpiece similar to the ones we had just looked at, use of gold background, mostly a very traditional approach here. Doesn't make direct reference to the Black Death, but they use it as reference here in the idea that some historians believe that the more progressive approach of Ambrogio Lorenzetti and Giotto were actually pushed aside due to the Black Death, and due to the fear that people felt at the time, there was therefore a return to more traditional approaches. There are some images as well from the time period that do show the effects of the Black Death. But again, in essence, it was an opportunity to remind people of their position and the fact that, again, you know, you're going to die, you better repent and, you know, follow the roles of Jesus in order to live on in everlasting life. So again, the Black Death was far, far worse than our current pandemic. Again, as many as 50% of cities died, which in Philadelphia would mean about 750,000 people. The area around Philly itself is probably 6 or 7 million people. So again, we would be looking at maybe 3 million people dying just in the Philadelphia area alone, where we're nowhere near numbers like that, even in the entire country. So as bad as it may seem, it was worse right before the Renaissance began. So hopefully things, you know, in an upbeat way of looking at it, hopefully a prosperous and great period will come out of where we are now. So that is all I am going to cover for, this is just an image that's in the text that shows about the way that the frescoes are painted. So that covers what we will cover for chapter 18. Again, I will be making a video for an introduction, and then I will be doing lectures like this one for each of the sections throughout the course. Thanks. See you at the next lecture.